Understanding the book of Daniel is takes a lot of study, um, but it can be rewarding. Uh, One thing that people don't realize about Daniel 8 and 9 is that it switches back to, or it switches to Hebrew from Aramaic in chapter 8. Of course, in the original manuscript, there was no like chapter break to separate the two. Another thing you have to realize too is there is a distinction in the language translated vision. In particular, in Daniel 8 and 9, I want to focus on that connects to the two, and I'll show you why briefly, just so you can see something basic of how the distinction between the two words, both translated vision in the English, the mare and the hazon, two words translated vision. And you think, well, why did they do that? Well, does it matter? The answer is yes, it does, and the text indicates that, and I'll show you that right now. So here's Daniel 9. I'm gonna start from Daniel 9 and work back into Daniel 8 to show you something briefly. Notice that the angels come to answer Daniel's prayer. Okay. While I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin for the sin of my people Israel and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision, this is the word chazon, okay? So he refers to the hazon. So that's the red. When the vision is red, it's hazon. The other word, mare, is blue, okay? And you'll see why there's a distinction worth noting. So he's referring back to Daniel 8, which starts with this vision, the hazon vision, and he uses that term over and over, like 4 or 5 times before this other term comes up, okay? The beginning of Daniel 8. And that's when the angel first came to him in the vision in Daniel 8. So he's like, yeah, and so this Gabriel showed up that I'd seen in the hazon or vision at the beginning. So we have him referring back to the last time he had this vision with this angel. Okay, so there's our first clue that this is in the same context of Daniel 8. Okay, note that. And being caused to fly swiftly touched me about the time of the evening oblation. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give you skill and understanding. So he's answering the prayer. Daniel is praying about his people, right? And this angel from the vision, Hazon, appears. And he comes to give Daniel understanding. At the beginning of your supplication, the commandment came forth, and I come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore, understand the matter. Understand. I've come to give you understanding. Understand. Since you don't understand, I've come to give you understanding. Okay? And consider the mare, the other word for vision. So he refers back into Daniel 8, referencing the same angel, and we'll go back there in a second. Angel shows up and twice says he's come to give him understanding and for him to consider the mare. So here's my question. What mare? He's referring back to something that he didn't have understanding about, that he was praying about something. And now this angel has come to give him understanding of the mare, not the hazon. So there's two different words. What is he referring to? What didn't he understand? Okay, vision, two different words, right? And consider the mare. He's come to give him understanding, to make him understand the matter. Well, is there something he didn't understand? Let's back up. How does Daniel chapter 8 end? And the mare of the evenings and mornings, which is told as true, wherefore shut up the hazon, because it's back here in the chapter further. This is the very end of chapter 8 right here. This is how chapter 8 ends. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for certain days afterward. I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the mare, but none understood it. So he doesn't understand what this means, the mare. the red portion of this vision, which is kind of like the whole thing here. He's told, look, I want you to understand this mare. The part that has to do with the other word is shut up and for many days in the future. So vision, that word for vision is how it's referred to at the whole beginning of the chapter. He's getting this vision, right? And it's explaining it. And then he hears the angels talking, and he hears one say, how long shall tell this vision concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, that the sanctuary and the host be trodden underfoot? And he said, unto me, unto 2,300 days. So it's looking to the end, till that's when it's over. That's when the transgression is over. After 2,300 days, in other words, right? So all this whole thing that's being talked about with the ram and the goat is a chazon. And then he asks, how long till this is over? And he says, 2,300 days, evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be cleansed. And it came to pass when I, Daniel, had seen this vision, with everything so far has been referred to as this chazon, and he wanted to understand its meaning. And then all of a sudden it says, and then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. This is the first time the word mare, which is translated vision, but not here for one time here. All of a sudden he wants to understand this vision, and then he wanted to know its meaning. And then all of a sudden there's the mare of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Eli, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man, Daniel, to understand the mare, which is another word for vision, which is associated with the appearance of this man. By the way, it's Jesus before the incarnation. So he came near where I stood, and notice this is where you see the distinction between the visions. It's necessary that there's a distinction, although they overlap and are related. In other words, one is part of the other one. One is referring to the end of the 2,300 evening mornings, and this mare, which is what he comes, and he tells Gabriel to make Daniel understand this part of it, the mare. But the end of the larger 2,300 is for many days in the future. It's sealed up. He wants to know the meaning of the whole thing, and he's like, this guy shows up, and he's like, no, make him understand the mare. It's like, what's the mare? And then he says this again. Look, understand. Daniel's inquiring about the chazon vision regarding the end of the 2,300. This guy shows up. He's like, no, make him understand the mare. But Daniel's seeking the whole thing, or the end of the 2,300. And this guy shows up, no, make him understand the mare, even though he wants to know this other vision, word for vision. And here's why that's absolutely has to be the case. Notice what Daniel wants to know about the whole vision, the 2,300. This guy shows up, says, no, make him understand the mare, knowing that Daniel wants to understand the chazon, which has been tied to the end of the 2,300, right? How long unto 2,300? And then it says that it's sealed up. Daniel wants to know about it. He inquires. He's like, nope, tell him. Daniel overhears the man that shows up that's associated with this word of mare. Make him understand this mare. And then knowing that Daniel is asking about the chazon, this man comes up and says, understand, Daniel, son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the chazon, the thing you asked about that's been related to the end of the 2,300. That's sealed up. That's for many days in the future. That's for the time of the end. But this man who shows up says, make him understand the mare. And then he starts explaining the symbols of the prophecy. Right? But we don't know when this starts yet, nothing. The reality is the mare is the first part of the longer chazon vision, the red word. And the chazon is associated with the end of everything, the end of the sanctuary until the sanctuary is cleansed. The mare vision is like the first part. So that's how they're related. And of course, the mare, like we saw, is the portion associated with the man who shows up, which is the pre-incarnate Christ. And of course, the mare vision ends up being what? He didn't understand the mare. And then he starts praying, and then he's like, oh, the Gabriel guy shows up from back then when I was asking about the Chazon, and this guy's like, tell him about the Mare. And then he's like, the Mare is true of the evenings and mornings. It's of it. It's a part of it. But none understood it. Then he starts praying because he's like, the sanctuary is uncleansed, is going to be trodden underfoot or whatever. He's in Babylon, still in captivity at the end of the 70 years of Jeremiah, and they don't even have a temple. He starts. The temple's going to be trodden underfoot. We don't even have a temple. And so he starts praying about going back to Jerusalem so they can rebuild the temple. And he's getting a prophecy about, the daily being taken away. Does he think it's so right? He starts praying and he's confused, and he doesn't understand what? Doesn't understand. I was astonished at the Mare, but none understood it. So he's praying because he's confused. He's sick even, he says. And then Gabriel shows up, the one from the vision from the beginning of Daniel 8. And he's like, look, I've come forth to give you understanding. Therefore, understand the matter. And now consider the vision, Mare, the thing he didn't understand. Now the angel shows up and says, I'm come to make you understand. Therefore, understand and consider the thing that you didn't understand. And then he gives the 70 weeks prophecy. The 70 weeks prophecy, and then we get a decree date. And this decree date seals up the Chazon. That which has to happen, this has to happen first for the vision, the end of the 2300 to even happen. Why? Because it's something that happens in the new covenant many days in the future, at the time of the end. So whatever the 2300 is, it has to be after and or longer than the 70 weeks, which are 490 years. Because the Mare, parts of the Mare as it was being explained in Daniel 8, are covering the same period from Daniel's time unto the decree. And the 2300 is part of that, because the decree for Daniel's 70 weeks happens during the Persian period, which is what this vision is starting. He's in the Persian, it's after Babylon. And that's when the decree for the 70 weeks. The decree for the 70 weeks is the same decree for the entire vision. It's the starting point. But the end of the 2300 is for many days in the future. It's sealed up until the time of the end. And that's what it says in Daniel 12. Many will go to and fro, and knowledge will increase. What knowledge? About this. So the Mare gets explained here because he's referencing the thing he didn't understand, and he's praying about, and the angel comes to give him understanding of that thing and that Mare, and then the Mare is the 70 weeks. Prophecy of Jesus coming. And that's why it's the appearance of a man. That's Jesus showing up in the vision. The appearance of a man. And this word Mare is then associated in Daniel 10 as well with Jesus, who shows up in Daniel 10 in the vision. The Mare is the Messiah's prophecy of the Messiah. So right there, that's the main point, though. He doesn't understand the Mare, which is not the same thing as this other thing, which he was asking about, the Chazon. The red is the Chazon, word for Chazon, concerning the daily. And Jesus even quotes about this desolation in his ministry as a future thing in his day as well, when you read Daniel the prophet. So it can't be Antiochus unless the 2300 is the time of the end. And if that would mean it ended before the Jesus was even born, let alone the 69th week comes. And the time of the end in Daniel 11 is associated with the resurrection from the dead. So Daniel's asking about the end of the 2300, and he's like, dude, no, this guy shows up, make him understand the Mare, which is the appearance of this man. It's mighty man. And then the dude comes up to Daniel knowing he's inquiring about the end of the 2300, and he says, look, understand, O time of man, I want you to understand the Mare. For at the time of the end shall be the Hazon. You want to know about the Hazon? No, I'm coming to tell you about the Mare. Why? Because this comes first. And it gives you the starting point of the time prophecies. Because essentially the Mare is the Chazon, partly. It's just the first, it's the cut off. 70 weeks are cut off for your people in their holy city. So the Mare is the first portion of the 2300 evening mornings. And the end of the 2300 is for many days in the future. So the Mare is part of the vision of the time period of them being the same thing, right? Because the decree ends up being in the 7th year of Artaxerxes during the Persian period. That gives you a starting point for both, because the Mare is just a portion of the Chazon. It's the first portion from the decree until it starts the clock. So yes, these visions are talking about the same time period, but the Mare gives you that starting point in the 70th week prophecy in Daniel 9. And because it is the first portion, it starts in Persia, which is how the vision starts in Daniel 8. So they are, in a sense, the same time period being envisioned. They overlap. It's just that the first part of it, which is being described in Daniel 8, doesn't have a starting point. And that's what you get in Daniel 9. And that starting point is the appearance of the coming of Jesus. And that's why Paul can take the little horn from Daniel 7, because it's the same, ultimately will be the same power in Daniel 8, who comes out of the fourth beast well into the new covenant period after Jesus is ascended. And the apostasy occurs in the church, because Paul's saying it's a future event and it happens in the church, unless you think there's two different covenants, one for the Jews and one for the Christians. So the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2 is the man from the fourth kingdom of Rome, which is the little horn from Daniel 7, which is ultimately the power in Daniel 8 as well. And then that history is also described in the remaining chapters to Daniel 12. So the Mare is not understood at the end of chapter 8. None understood it. And Daniel 9, the angel shows up from the previous chapter. This is referring back. That's context. And the angel says what? To give Daniel understanding, to make him understand the vision. Give him understanding. Understanding of what? That which wasn't understood at the end of chapter 8, which is this Mare, which is what the guy said he came to make Daniel understand, is the Mare part of the larger vision. So Daniel wants to know about this word. This guy shows up. He's like, no, make him understand this vision. And then he even goes up to Daniel and says, bro, what you want to know about the end of the 2300, that's for the time of the end. I want you to understand the Mare, not the Chazon. I know you want to understand the Chazon, but that's for many days in the future. That's for the time of the end. Then he gives him some more information, because it's from the Persian period onward, which is part of both visions, because the one is the first part of the other, and it's cut off for Jerusalem. Shut up the Chazon, for it shall be for many days. I want you to understand this, which is of the evenings and mornings. The evenings and mornings is the 2300, the end of which is this vision. This is of the evenings and mornings, just like 7 days or a week is of a particular month. It's the first week of the month, but that week is part of the month. And thus this part of the vision, the Mare, which is the first part to come, is the first portion of the evenings and mornings, the 2300. But it's related to asking about how long the sanctuary till it's cleansed unto 2300. So at the end of it. And that aspect of it is way off into the future. So he's gotten some of this things that are happened in symbolic form of the Mare here in Daniel 8, which is also ultimately the first portion of the time period of this vision. This vision, when it's explained in Daniel 9, you get the starting point. And that's why 2,300 years after the starting point for the 70 weeks, which predicted Jesus' first coming, is why 1844 is legit. Because evenings and mornings are days, and days are in prophecy are a year. So he's been told part of the vision, but he still doesn't understand it. But he knows that it's true because the angel or the man that shows up, he told him he wants him to understand this, but he's confused. The sanctuary is not going to be cleansed, all this symbolism. And so he was astonished at the mare, which is what the guy says you got to know about, but none understood it. Then he gets the vision, he's praying, refers back to the Chazon vision and Gabriel. That's context, back to Daniel 8, which there was no chapter 8. But chapter 8 is in a new language in the original text. At chapter 7 ends the Aramaic and then goes to Hebrew. So 8 and 9 are definitely like a new unit in a certain sense, but it's also related to chapter 7. But it's kind of taking a new kind of approach here, kind of zooming in. And so he references that vision that's been being talked about in context. Angel shows up to give him understanding. He didn't understand. The guy who shows up wants him to understand the mare, not this vision. And what does he get? The guy shows up. And it's dealing with, it needs, the temple has to be rebuilt and the coming of the Messiah. So twice it says it. References back to the past chapter. And then the thing to understand is the same thing the guy who showed up, which is a pre-incarnate Christ, what he wants Gabriel to make him understand this mare, rather, and tells him this other end of this vision is for many days in the future for the time of the end. And then now we find out what the mare is. It actually gives us the starting point for the 2300 and the all the things that are being described in chapter 8. So this word determined is katak. It means cut off. It's the only time this word is in the Hebrew Bible. It's katak. Determined works because that's right. But when you look in the Mishnah from that time period, there's like 9 references. 8 out of the 9 are explicitly cut off, like cutting something off from a larger piece. Like in the temple, they would cut off the end of something. So the 70 weeks are literally cut off from what? The Chazon vision. It's the first part. The mare is of the evenings and mornings, the 2300. So with this vision, this gives us the starting point for both quote unquote visions, the 2300 and the 490 years, which we find out now is the coming of the Messiah, for the Jews to accept the Messiah. And then of course it ends up going to the nations that call back all the nations. So what's this 2300? Where the same figure in Daniel 11 into Daniel 12 is being described leading up to the time of trouble and the Michael standing up in the resurrection from the dead, which the New Testament uses to talk about the end of the world. So the time of the end is sometime after Jesus ascends in persecution and the apostasy in the church, and the end of it is called the time of the end. And that time of the end ends in the time of trouble and the resurrection from the dead and the second coming and the destruction of the Antichrist, according to 2 Thessalonians 2. So that's context. This other word for vision is not the same word here, and they are related and they are talking about the same time periods, but one is different from the other. The context demands it because Daniel asks about the Chazon and the angels is like, no, that's for the future. That's for the many days in the future. No, make him understand the mare, a different word translated vision. And then just to drive it home, that man that shows up that wants him to understand the mare, when he's inquiring about the Chazon, then after he says that, no, make him understand the mare. He's asking about the Chazon. And then he walks up to Daniel and says, yo, the Chazon, that's for many days in the future. And then he starts describing the mare. And then Daniel says, I don't understand it still. And then he's praying, and the same angel shows up regarding that came at the beginning of this vision and says, I've come to give you understanding. I've come to make you understand. He said he didn't understand the mare. And then he says, now consider the mare, and he gets the 70-week prophecy. So the Chazon, the end of the 2300, has to be after this mare portion, because that's before the thing that's said to be for the time of the end or many days in the future. You need to know about this. And then this gives you the starting point. And you realize that this part of the vision is cut off from the larger vision that ends in the end of the 2300. It has to be after this vision is over with. And because it says this vision seals up the larger vision, this word. Doesn't use this word, even though this word is this. So within the Mare vision, which is the 70 weeks, it then reverts back to sealing up what? Vision, this word, the thing that's for later. So this has to happen for this thing, which is for the time of the end, requires this to come first. Otherwise, why wouldn't they if this was just saying this is a fulfillment of this thing being described, it would use that word. It wouldn't use the other word either, it seems to me. So there's like three contextual, I don't know what you call that, like grammatical or narrative details that just, because some people will be like, well, why did they translate the both words vision in English? I don't know, because God wanted to conceal it. I don't know. They're two different words, and the way they interact with each other in the narrative, in the dialogue, demands that they're different. Because he's like, I want to know about this. And he's like, no, make him understand this, not that. Hey, Daniel, I know you want to understand this, but you need to understand that. They're differentiated by necessity according to the literal dialogue of the way they're used. And you wouldn't know that in the English. You wouldn't even know, because they're both just, it's just that vision. So you just wouldn't know which thing he's talking about. No, I don't want you to understand the vision. No, understand the vision. The vision is for the time of the end. Oh, no, the vision is for many days in the future. Understand the vision, though. It doesn't, you know, misread it. Two different words. Although they're both related, the time periods are the same. The Mare is the first part. And it's the explanation of the Mare that gives you the starting point for both, because they are overlapping. The first part's cut off from the larger vision of that ends in the end of the 2300. Because the Mare is of the evenings and mornings. And then we find out how. It's the first part of it. It's cut off. So it's pretty much demanded something, it's at least something like that. Things I think you can say, even if Adventist is wrong totally, which it really makes all sorts of sense. But there the few things that everything that people try to say this means that would refute the Adventist view are things that are actually, even if the Adventist view is wrong, are really doesn't make any sense. Even if the Adventist view is wrong, what is true is like the end of the 2300 has to be after the coming of the Messiah, which is the 70 weeks. And of course, this is like the greatest prophecy that proves Jesus is the Messiah in the whole Bible. So Adventists didn't invent this interpretive method. The 2300 years, the text actually demands it when you look at the original language. And so, but it sounds so much like Antiochus. Well, I'll just remind you, in the people think, oh, it's using imagery about the sanctuary, right? Well, what was the sanctuary looking forward to in the new covenant? That we need to keep doing animal sacrifices and have an earthly temple? Or did Jesus make it desolate and cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease because he's the one sacrifice for all? Okay. Then the question is, how should we interpret this temple language and the daily sacrifices that Jesus ends up taking out of the way because he's the one sacrifice for all, but he's not the little horn who changes God's law. See, that's the thing about this. This little horn is the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2. Is the same one little horn in Daniel 8 that does this thing well into the new covenant period. So this language is representing something that Jesus does, that these things were typing in the earthly sanctuary. And by the way, in the King James, it says the daily sacrifice. It actually says, so Olat Tamid is sacrifice daily. Olat Tamid. The olah is the word for sacrifice, and tamid is like the continual or daily sacrifice that they did, evening and morning sacrifices. So it's usually the continual sacrifices, the daily sacrifices, is olat tamid. Tamid being the word, the adjective, the daily sacrifice, but it's backwards in Hebrew, so it's olat tamid, sacrifice daily. So the noun that may or may not have a definite article, like the olat, the daily sacrifice. The olat tamid is the sacrifice daily or continually. Tamid is the adjective. In Daniel 8 here, which is using symbolic imagery, it actually doesn't have the noun for the sacrifice. The word sacrifice doesn't exist in Daniel 8. Okay. And the daily, the word, the adjective that about the daily sacrifice in normal narrative, talking about the earthly sanctuary and the sacrifices they did on earth, that functions as the adjective. But here, there is no noun for sacrifice. The word sacrifice isn't in here. And the word daily, that's an adjective, is used as a noun with the definite article. So it's not the daily sacrifices, it's literally the continual. He takes away the continual or the daily. An adjective functioning as a noun only in here. The translators add the word sacrifice. It's really the daily or the continual. Every time. No sacrifice. There's no word for sacrifice in the entire chapter. Okay. So there's that. And even to the host of heaven, it cast down some of the hosts, and the stars of the ground stamped on them. He made himself even to the prince of the host. By the way, who's the prince of the host? It's the same guy in Joshua 5 who makes Joshua take off his shoes because he's standing on holy ground and he has a flaming sword. Whose side are you on? I'm on neither of your side in this case. I'm the captain of the host of heaven, the flaming sword. It's Michael. Michael is the prince of the host. And Michael is the prince of Israel. The Lord's portion, when he separated the nations at Babel, but he set aside Jacob as the Lord's portion. Who do you think was the divine being that leads the host of the messengers of heaven, who is the Lord, who is like God is, who's over Jacob's Israel, God's people? Who do you think the angel was that was appointed over Israel? Well, it's no created being, but it's the one who opposes the adversary. Is Jesus. Jesus is the prince of the host, prince of the covenant, prince of God's people, the savior of God's people. When he divvied out the nations to the sons of God, the angels of God, the principalities and powers. But this Jesus is over God's people, the prince of the covenant, and he brings it. So this language is Satan opposing Michael or Jesus. Do you like a chocolate milk? So I want to read this. Is interesting. All the reformers thought it was Jesus too, by the way, because they're right, because they knew the continuity between the covenants in that way. Listen to this. Colossians 2 and Romans 14, people use against the Sabbath, even though Romans 14 has nothing to do with the Sabbath. And the whole book of Romans never talks about the Sabbath, but Paul would just dispense with the Sabbath in Romans 4, kind of just nonchalant, randomly, without mentioning the word Sabbath. And they had to have a council over like circumcision, and they kept keeping Sabbath, but he's just doing away with it. Nobody said anything. Consider the history of the Sabbath in the first covenant people and how seriously they took it, and the stories associated with it, and God's anger when they didn't listen. So listen, this is good. Some people say the seventh-day Sabbath is rejecting Christ for the law. Is that Judaizing? Well, Jesus was a Jew by birth and nation, as was the Apostle Paul, and all the apostles, in fact. And the seventh-day Sabbath existed before the Jews existed, of course, and before sin entered the world. Let's see. So some people will say, when people argue from Romans 14 or Colossians 2, there's like a fatal flaw. They say, or they assert that let's see, that there's no scriptural authority for them to oppose the seventh-day Sabbath as repealed, or even for them not to keep it, and no reason for them to keep Sunday. If you do away with the Sabbath and then try to impose Sunday, this is absurd, right? For when Paul would actually be teaching any day and not exclusively Sunday, if Romans 14 and Colossians 2, in fact, is doing away with the Sabbath. Why would they call it, why would the Lord's Day be in, some reference to Sunday worship? Oh, they were keeping Sunday. Oh, so now it's Sunday. So he does away with the Sabbath to impose a new Sabbath. I see. That's very clever. Did Paul teach Sunday or just any day, 1 and 7? There's no authority in these texts for Sunday. And the theory would also, the theory of, let's see, the day of, let's see, God never blessed one day in 7 without blessing a particular day. Think about that. They'll say, well, the principle is 1 and 7. The Presbyterians say this all the time because they want to uphold the commandments, and they'll try to appeal to the Sunday verses. But then sometimes they'll try to appeal to Romans 14 to do away with the Sabbath. It's like, dude, can't do that. If you're going to appeal to the 10 commandments, you can't appeal. These verses aren't talking about doing away with the Sabbath. They're about doubtful disputations or the sacrificial system. You can't bless one day in 7 without blessing a particular day. It says the Sabbath, the seventh day in Genesis anyways. He either blessed some definite object or definite particular time, or he didn't bless anything. You could say that God blessed one day in 7, but if you mean that this act of blessing didn't terminate on any particular day, you ought to know that you're asserting what is naturally impossible. As well, you might say of a band of robbers that they had killed one man in 7. Well, in reality, they had killed no man in particular. No, brethren, yourselves know very well that God had not blessed and sanctified any day, but the 7th of the 7, prior to the giving of the written law. You know that if God blessed any day of the week at all, it was a definite day, distinct from all the other days of the week. But this commandment says the Lord blessed the Sabbath day. Therefore, the Sabbath day must be a particular day of the week. So the Sabbath day is not one day in 7 or an indefinite 7th part of time. Therefore, it is not one day in 7 that we are required to remember and keep holy, and in which we are forbidden to do any work, but the 7th day of the week, which was then, is now, and will be till the end of time, the day of the Sabbath of the Lord your God. This one's funny. This part's funny. By the way, Paul says the law is present tense, holy, just, and good, and spiritual. And that the purpose of Christ was to make the righteousness of the law manifest in us, and he condemns sin in the flesh. So he says it is holy, just, and good. Paul did when he wrote that, way after Jesus ascended to heaven. Is the law sin? God forbid. We establish the law. It's holy, just, and good. Is present tense. So he didn't think Jesus did away with it because it's present tense, holy, just, and good, and spiritual. So some people will appeal to, well, Paul preached on Sunday, proving it to be the day of rest. Really? Think about how people, well, look, they broke bread on Sunday. And then it's like, oh, wait, that wasn't actually even Sunday. Oh, look, they took up an offering. Is they imagine that they went to church on Sunday and took a collection plate. Like, what does it actually say? What does breaking bread actually mean? Doesn't sound like the Eucharist, I can say that much. They broke bread in fellowship. That means they went to church and took up an offering and turn food into the body of Jesus and ate it? Or does breaking bread mean they ate a meal together in fellowship, like they did on every day? Well, Paul preached on Sunday, proving it the day of rest in Acts 20, verse 7. But the funny thing is, this is mostly a seventh-day Sabbath meeting that ran long into the first day, because the first day starts at sundown on our Saturday. And so the 24-hour period is evening and then morning. So our Saturday night is actually Sunday night. In other words, our Saturday evening is the first day of the week. When the sun goes down on Saturday, that's the night portion of the first day of the week, quote unquote Sunday. But it's really that Jesus rose on the 24-hour period after the Sabbath 24-hour period. He didn't necessarily raise on Sunday midnight to midnight as we do it, right? He rose on the day after the Sabbath, which starts at sundown on our Saturday. He rose sometime after the sun went down on Saturday and before the sun came up on Sunday, which is the day after the Sabbath, the third day. So people get really confused about this because they mix up the Roman time or modern time with the biblical time. For Paul was traveling on Sunday, Acts 20, verse 11. The breaking of bread was not exclusive to Sunday, Acts 2, 42 through 46, 1 Corinthians 11, 25. The fact that he broke bread on Sunday only shows the necessity in performing the service before leaving a few hours later to return. In 1 Corinthians 16:2, they would have us believe that Paul directed weekly observance to the first day. Yet notice the clauses by him and in store. In store for when, in store where. For at the time of his coming, he was not to be hindered by gathering. Verse 3 says why. And it certainly could not be given if it was being gathered. But as already has been shown, Paul kept the seventh day and would not have things being gathered on it. Notice, the apostle simply orders that each one of the Corinthian brethren should lay up at home some portion of his weekly gain on the first day of the week. The whole question turns upon the meaning of the expression by him, and I marveled greatly how you can imagine that it means in the collection box of the congregation, says Greenfield in his lexicon, translating the Greek, by oneself, i.e. at home. Two Latin versions, the Vulgate and that of Castellio, render it apud se, with oneself at home. Three French translation, Martin, Osterwald, and de Sacy, Chesoy, at his house, at home. The German of Luther, bei sich selbst, means, or nor sig self, near himself. All these different translations, in his own house, with himself. The Swedish says near himself. In other words, lay it up at home on the first day of the week, and then so I can gather it when I show up. It doesn't say like Greenfield in his lexicon says, the whole question turns upon the meaning of the expression by him in the text, and I marvel greatly how you can imagine that it means in the collection box of the congregation. They probably didn't even have churches yet. And he lists a bunch of different translations in Italian, Dutch, French, Portuguese, paraiso, with himself, the Swedish, nor sig self, near himself. I know not how much this list of authorities might be swelled, for I have not examined one translation that differs from those quoted above. J.W. Morton, Vindication of the Sabbath. Here's why Paul gave this direction. And worse still, they claim the apostles met that first day of the week on which the resurrection took place to commemorate that event. Don't they know the apostles did not believe he had risen in Mark 16 or John 20? It is further urged the apostles met after 8 days from the first day, again, to commemorate his resurrection in John 20:26. Yet notice that after 8 days from the first day of the week was not and could not ever be the first day of the week. 8 days after the first week would be the second day of the week. If that verse is saying they met on Sundays, well, this is 8 days after a Sunday. Doesn't make any sense. Even if they did, does it say anything about changing the Sabbath or that breaking bread is taking communion or taking up a collection as though they have like churches established at that point? It's think about it. The fact that people appeal to these verses is all you need to really just step back and go, wait a minute. It's worse than absent from the body is present with the Lord. I don't mean to be a jerk about it. I'm just like, it's so annoying because people don't change their mind, and it's so obviously wrong. And it's so obviously absurd to quote these verses. And then you look at the context and it's like, oh, that's your proof that the Sabbath is changed to Sunday in the Bible. How pathetic. How dishonest and disloyal to God are you to use that from the scriptures to argue that they changed the Sabbath to Sunday in the New Testament because you're a Protestant. How pathetic. What a joke. It's a laughing stock. It's pathetic. Don't do that. It's dishonest. It's misleading. And you're actually using the word of God to say the Sabbath is changed. And you ought to know better how dumb that is. Because the texts aren't saying that. You're misusing them and ignoring the context. And in reality, a cursory look at the verses. And people still, John MacArthur, for instance, they'll still appeal to these verses. It's the most dishonest and pathetic exegesis I've ever seen. And then they have the nerve to call Adventist cult members. How pathetic. Not impressed. Okay, finally, they claim that John is speaking of Sunday in Revelation 1:10. Let's see if that is what he meant by whether he refers to Sunday, the first day, as the Lord's Day. The Revelation was written 26 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. His gospel, John, was written in AD 97, they say here at Ephesus. He does not use the term Lord's Day, Sabbath day, when referring to the resurrection day. Simply the first day is given it in Genesis, John 20, verse 1 and verse 19, Genesis 1:5. The books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written in AD 41, 64, and 60. Nor do the gospel writers give Sunday that sacred title. So think about it. The books are written after the events. And they talk about the Sabbath and the first day of the week in their narratives. They refer to the days as at the time they're writing. Like when you're reading the narrative of the Gospels and then the book of Revelation, think about the timeline of historically is different than the timeline of the time when they're writing down the narrative in history. Okay, so you got to remember when they're writing it. So they can refer to things as they're writing, referring to a past event. Like when they're writing John, he calls it like the Feast of the Jews, writing it as though he's like from a Christian point of view, perhaps. Okay, I'm not going to argue about that, but that could have been a later scribe or whatever. But my point is, they're going to call Sunday the Lord's Day. Why wouldn't they refer to that day which they're talking about in their narrative as they're writing after the fact, if it's indeed become the Lord's Day? Why only refer to it this one time when Revelation is written to as the Lord's Day, if that's now the Lord's Day at your time of writing the narrative? And here they resort to confusing the explanation as the Ten Commandments are symbolic and literal, or ceremonial and moral. They assert the seventh day as being symbolic and ceremonial, then introduce Sunday as a literal and moral command. Oh, the Sabbath was a ceremonial law, even though it's in the middle of the quote unquote moral law. The people who argue this make those distinctions historically. Oh, the Sabbath was just like a ceremony, just like the rest of the appointed times. You don't have to do that. We rest in Jesus now. So we don't need to do that ceremonial law that they used to have to do, because it's ceremonial, it's not moral. But now we keep the Lord's Day. Oh, and by the way, it's moral. It's a moral law. You have to honor the Lord's Day. And we call it the Sabbath the last 1,000 years, just because that's what we received. But yeah, the Sabbath isn't a moral command. But you have to keep Sunday. We didn't do away with the Sabbath. Sabbath is Saturday. We keep the Lord's Day. The Sabbath is done away with. It's not even a moral law. So we didn't change the Sabbath. We just tell you people that you don't keep the commandment of God. We just did away with it. Oh, and by the way, you got to keep this new day, kind of like the Sabbath, pretty much. And if you don't, it's a sin, because it's a moral law. Again, shame on you. Do you have any respect for the Word of God? They assert that the seventh day is being symbolic and ceremonial, then introduce Sunday as though it's literal and moral. But we have no language as such. This assertion leads to a most lamentable absurdity in Exodus 28, verse through 11. For then the fourth commandment would read, remember the first day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the first day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the first day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the first day and hallowed it. But unfortunately, Revelation 14, 22, 14, Matthew 5, 17 through 19, etc., say otherwise. For a change in day to have originated by God, to have taken place, it is to be in plain direct language, as is this: remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Because he hallowed it, made it holy, because he rested. That's the day which God calls his. The Lord calls the Sabbath day his day, and Jesus declares himself Lord of the Sabbath, and that he made it for the benefit of man, which the Pharisees were perverting, just like people today don't afford it to their people. They work rather than rest in Jesus on the Sabbath. And of course, we know that means they're works-based heretics, and God's going to torture them forever for that, of course. Just kidding. And then remember what it says about Jesus in Isaiah 42, 21, a messianic prophecy about the suffering servant in Isaiah, which he quotes of himself from Isaiah 61 when he starts his ministry and goes into the temple and then declares this has been fulfilled, that he's setting the captives free, he's giving sight to the blind, healing the brokenhearted. What's their problem? What do they need help for? They need to be freed from the evil Old Testament God's law, or they need to be freed from the bondage of sin and death, and to walk in liberty in the ways of the God who is love, who died for sinners. But one of the messianic prophecies Isaiah said was that the Lord is well pleased for his righteousness' sake. He will magnify the law and make it honorable. It's the little horn from Daniel 7 that Jesus destroys with the breath of his mouth and the brightness of his coming. The light that is Jesus, that he exemplified in showing us how to be human and how to love and to be freed from sin and death. The light of him returning and the breath of his mouth, the word of his mouth, the truth of his utterances, and the brightness of his light exposing sin and evil and death, it will destroy that man of sin who seeks to change God's times and laws and speaks blasphemies against God. They accused Jesus of speaking blasphemies, but they were wrong, because he can forgive sins and he is equal with God. But this guy thinks he talks for God, but he doesn't. He comes in his own name, not the name of the Father. And so he has some other thing because he cares about what men think, not the honor that only comes from the one true God, like Jesus. Oh, you believe in the Trinity? That's nice. Did your Trinity Jesus do away with the law? Well, the Bible says the little horn does that. The man of sin who implements the mark of the beast and causes people to have allegiance with him and not Jesus, the one true God, who's equal with the Father and the Holy Spirit. These three are one. That God comes with the love of the Father. This other guy, he thinks men can change the law of God. He seeks to change God's law. You know, the lawlessness abounding in the end times because the love of many will wax cold because of lawlessness abounding, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. If you love me, keep my commandments, Jesus said. It's just a refrain that he said in the Old Testament. Him and his Father said. He will magnify the law and make it honorable. He'll say stuff like, you have heard it said, you know, an eye for an eye, but I say, you know, turn your other cheek. I say, I'm going to tell you what the spirit of the law is. Oh, you think you're good because you don't murder? Well, if you hate your brother, it's like murder. It's all from the heart. And so walking in the spirit would mean you have love and not hate for your brother. And yes, that, you know what else that means? It means you keep the letter of the law in that sense. The spirit of the law isn't kept while you're breaking the letter of the law, the rule. The spirit is actually deeper. Notice what it says. If you're not honoring the seventh day, you're not honoring Jesus as the creator, which he declared himself to be a Lord of the Sabbath. So he is the maker of it and all things, and he's the redeemer. He made all things and provided a way that man should not forget his beneficent maker. Matthew 24, verse 20, a Sabbath remains. Or Hebrews 4 through 11 says that God rested. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Jesus says in Matthew 24, in the time period, at least many years after he's ascended into heaven, even if you're a full preterist, this would apply. But he said, pray your flight not come on the Sabbath day. When Jesus was dead, and it was the sun was about to go down and the Sabbath day begins, they hurried him off the cross and kept the Sabbath according to the commandment. Would they have done that when their master is dead and they're burying him? Keep the Sabbath if he said anything about the Sabbath being done away with? You think they might have not kept the Sabbath when they're dealing with his body? Or was that a burden to honor the Sabbath? If Jesus said the Sabbath was done away with it and gave any hint of it, they wouldn't have been obeying the commandment if he had said anything about not keeping it. But they didn't. They kept it according to the commandment, even when burying their master. Think about that. Jesus refers to the Sabbath as being, pray your flight not come on in the Sabbath in the winter on the Sabbath day. That's at least 70 AD he's talking about, if not, but also the end of the world. Now, if Jesus didn't do away with it, can Paul do away with it? Could Paul do away with it and nobody bring it up in the council at Jerusalem? Just slip their mind. They're like, all people are like, I think it get circumcised, and they had to have a council over it. You know why the Sabbath didn't come up? Because nobody did away with it. It's a blessing. It was a thing you're supposed to do, but it was also a blessing. And Jesus taught that the entire time when they were trying to put him under the bondage of doing something other than being afforded the actual Sabbath that God instituted for man's benefit. And every time the Pharisees tried to give him guff for doing things that's appropriate to do on the Sabbath, he rebuked them. Why? Because the Sabbath is done away with? No, absolutely not. Because they're making it a burden, but it's not a burden. It's the day that is holy because God rested on it as the creator of everything. So honoring it is recognizing that because he said it's holy, and it's still holy, whether you like it or not. And you can't use the Bible to say otherwise because it doesn't say that. He said, he abideth in him ought himself to walk also as he walked, teaching, healing, feeding, and relieving suffering. For in this they array Christ against Christ and forget him as creator. And right here is unavoidable, undeniable proof that the Ten Commandments could not be repealed. Had this been so, he need not have died for the violated law. There remains then a certain unambiguous and unmistakable day which God and Christ have chosen, the Sabbath day. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. The day that the Lord hath made to rest on throughout eternity, Isaiah 66. As the new heavens and new earth shall remain before me, all flesh, from one new moon to another, from every Sabbath to another, all flesh shall come worship before me, says the Lord. In the new heavens and the new earth, all flesh, every Sabbath, worship me, the Creator. That's not a metaphor. And what on the seventh day a discrepancy is claimed in the history of the week? We don't even know what day of the week it really is. It could be Monday. It could be Thursday. We don't even know. Really? If we don't know when the seventh day Sabbath is for sure, then we don't know when the first day of the resurrection was then. Did Jesus know what day of the week it was? Think about how exactly you could imagine no one knowing what day of the week it was when there's like millions of people at all times in history existing all over the planet, following, most of which, at least if not all, following a weekly cycle where one day comes after the next. Changing the calendar year and the days of the month, you could change that with an official calendar. You could remove days to like adjust because like you're keeping the year wrong and you need the cycle of seasons to start the same beginning of the year every year. And if your calendar is bad and you have a bad calendar for like many years or decades, it'll start to get off. So like the seasons wouldn't fall at the right time of year according to the calendar. And so you could make an adjustment and just remove days like they did in several hundred years ago. They just like took out 10 days out of October to realign the seasons with the calendar. But even though it went from like October 3 to like October 16 or whatever it was, I forget, something like that. When it went from October 3 to, let's just as an example, when it went to October 3 and the next day was October 16 and October 3 was a Monday, when it went to October 16, it was still Tuesday the next day. You can't just change the days of the week. It doesn't work like that. Because everybody else would know that day is the next day of the week, second day from the Sabbath, or the day after the Sabbath. The weekly cycle stands on its own. It's just one day every seventh day. Start over. It's not the same as the Hebrew calendar. It's almost like there's a distinction or something. Like one was set up before sin. One's set up to implement the appointed times that are types of how God makes them clean and shows his holiness and allows his presence to be with them until Jesus comes and dies on those days that were temporary and geographically centered. Now this message goes worldwide. This is why there's no unity in those who think you're supposed to keep the feast, because no one knows, well, who sights the moon and from where? And is it a full moon or a partial moon? Because the months start by sighting of the moon from Jerusalem in the Old Covenant. If you had to keep the feast or you're sinning or something, well, first of all, those were enacted to deal with the sin problem, which God introduces sacrifice, and then he does these interventions. They become holidays, and that's associated with the temple in Jerusalem and the coming near to God and having your sins forgiven. All that system is associated with that. And those festivals and the things they did, the appointed times, were based on the sighting of the moon, which told you when the first of the month was. And then you counted the days once the month started to get to the holy day, which is based on sighting the moon from Jerusalem. And then that's the beginning of the month. And then 7 days later is this festival, or 14 days later, whatever. So it requires that you sight the moon from a particular location and then count the days, because the moon tells you when the months start. That is not set up for worldwide, and that's why nobody can agree. Like, let's say they spread the message, everybody's supposed to keep all the feasts, They didn't really set up like we got to have the head of church in Jerusalem now, since the the Sanhedrin's done away with, and Jesus said the temple's gone now. Well, all that is associated with that. Jesus is the one sacrificed, and now he's in heaven. And he said, the time is coming where those who worship me will worship me in spirit and truth, and it won't have to be at the temple in Jerusalem. He leaves their house to them desolate. There is no, they lost their authority. The Day of Atonement sacrifice wasn't needed anymore. Because Jesus is the high priest from heaven. And so saying people are supposed to keep the feast now, when Jesus banished the temple and ascended into the heavenly temple with one sacrifice for all, nobody in the early church tried to set up a head church in Jerusalem so that they could, and how would they even get that out to this worldwide message that's spreading across the world? They didn't have phones and the internet. They can't, how would people in another country know when the sighting of the moon happened in Jerusalem? Like by carrier pigeon? This is not a system set up for worldwide, but the gospel is set up for worldwide. And guess what? The weekly cycle works worldwide, but the Hebrew calendar, not only is it not set up to do that, or did anyone set that up in Jerusalem in the text, but it wouldn't work worldwide even if they did. It was clearly set up for a particular time period from Jerusalem when all the people of God were nearby. And that even became problematic as they spread out in the dispersion or whatever. Here's a question. Is it a sin to not keep the feast? I say no, it isn't. But it is a sin to neglect the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, because it is a moral law. It's associated with your daily working 6 days. And you have to afford a rest day. And if you're a believer, it's commemorated by the true creator God, who is the creator, who created the world in 7 days and rested the seventh day and declared that day holy. If you're in the covenant, in the covenant, you are supposed to honor the true God, and it's supposed to be a blessing and a holy convocation. And to not afford that to people is bad for them and bad for you, and it dishonors God. And so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Don't forsake the gathering together of yourselves, especially as you see the day approaching. It's not Jesus or the Sabbath. It's Jesus is your Sabbath, your ultimate rest. But what did he not? Was it a burden to have to rest 1 day a week before sin entered the world when he implemented it? Is it a sin to not make people work 7 days a week? No, it's a sin if you don't work 6 days and rest 1 day. If you don't afford that to your employees, if you don't afford that to your beast of burden, it would be immoral. And it would be dishonoring God, who said that day is holy. So that's my argument. Romans 14 doesn't talk about the Sabbath. It's talking about doubtful disputations. Most likely, it was a big topic in the first century, like what days you should feast on. So he was, or I mean, not feast, but what days you should fast on. And certain people said you're supposed to do it these days, and they were saying, "Oh, it's these days." There's a doubt. It's not in the law, so it's a doubtful disputation. The notion that Paul's talking about the Sabbath in Romans 14 is like, if you actually stop and just think about it for a second, like think of the context, the cultural context, like in Judea, and they're like dealing with this new covenant where God forgives the sins of their disobedience for disobeying the law. And then he's just like saying, "Oh, the Sabbath's done away with." That's like so anachronistically, like reading your current position in like a church that has never cared about the Sabbath and ignoring what that is, how that could possibly be what's going on is so like, yeah, Paul was probably wearing a Pope's hat and like, gilding the home churches with gold and making them, turns. Well, I don't want to be mean, actually. I'm just saying, like, the cultural context is like to think that Paul would say that and like just nonchalant, not say the word Sabbath. And like, oh, it's a doubtful disputation. Like the Sabbath wasn't like this huge deal in the history of the people. Like they just not really talking about the Sabbath, but since I said the word days and don't judge your brother, it must. And since I don't keep the Sabbath, it must be talking about this. That's just like no scholar worth their weight in salt would make such a insane claim unless they're like they swallowed it, they just drank the whole Kool-Aid gallon of Kool-Aid for their whatever group they're with. I think a lot of this comes really the issue with Colossians 2 though is look, it's really weird that people who are pronomian, like the Hebrew roots, and there's a mix here with like the 70 weeks of Daniel. I think a lot of people haven't studied it really good. And so there's just like, that's another thing. There's just no unity in the group, in their teachings, because they need to like have a gathering of Hebrew roots people, because so many fundamental things that someone asserts, and then a whole like sect of the movement goes in that direction, and they go way off course, way weird off course. And then some of them end up just like going to Judaism. I mainly agree with a lot of Hebrew roots, like hermeneutical principles. Like I'm for the food laws. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to like remember the feast days. Generally, the whole law is good. But regarding the things tied to the sacrifice, look, the sacrifices are done away with. We're not going to be doing sacrifices again. Just so you know. I watched my other video. I feel bad though, because I identify with these people. And I feel like kind of like we're in their camp in a certain sense, depending on how wacky they are. But like, I love like David Wilbur and Lex from Unlearn the Lies, and Michael Rood is good on a lot of stuff, are interesting, you know, and a lot of other people too. I just think it's a mistake to try to bring the whole thing over to the law of Moses. It's really not saying that. It's quite clear that it just logically, the system was clearly not meant to be worldwide, at least in this age for sure, without a temple. It's like, do you think God was taking, oh, I guess I kind of set that up bad. It's like, why did he set up the Sabbath differently in the weekly cycle? And like, why did he, and some of these people say the Torah is eternal. And it's like, it depends on what you mean. It's like they work back from this conclusion. Well, when it says law, it means the entire law of Moses. Like, dude, the New Testament tells you that there's things from the law of Moses that we're not supposed to do. Like to make people do that would be wrong. So like, come to grips with the fact that there is modification and that you can draw lines based on like logic. Like the 10 commandments obviously are not done away with. The food laws, you can like, I don't think we should go around threatening people like they're going to go to hell or something, but like, why wouldn't you keep the food laws if God said like, that's not food. That thing eats poop for a living. Maybe don't eat that. Maybe eating something that builds its entire body structure by eating feces because it's a bottom feeder. Like it literally is built on eating poop. And sometimes when people eat those things, they eat them raw and they have poop in them. The poop that they're eating becomes the poop that they're stuffed with, and people eat it, you know, like shrimp. It's disgusting. Doesn't that just seem like there's probably a reason that wasn't clean or called an abomination, you know? Some of these animals are like bad for you. Like it's not random. Like, oh, you can't eat a cow, but you can eat a horse. You can eat a, you know, it's like there's actually like characteristics of certain kind of animals, and like you can categorize them and realize, oh yeah, things without scales are usually bottom feeders. Oh yeah, these animals are like have certain things about them that make them unhealthy to eat, like pork. It's pretty much bad for you, period. I mean, but whatever. Some of them are harder to, you know, I don't think we're gonna have slavery again. And so we can have slavery laws so we can have slaves and enslave people. I don't think, I think some of them are more like principles that are like particular to a certain cultural time period. So in that sense, it's like I'm for the whole law. But as far as like you could say the parts of the law that were pointing to Christ is a shadow that have to do with cleansing the people, coming near to God, and coming into God's presence. It's like that's what Hebrews 9 says, man. Those things were temporary and they were against them. When you're it's just kind of like he hated Esau, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. It's not saying he literally hates Esau. It means it's like it's like loved less, right? Like, so when it says that it was against us, well, look at the context of Hebrews 9 and put it next to Colossians 2 and Ephesians. It's obvious. The things that they had to do to be cleansed to come near to God in the temple so that God could dwell with them were temporary, pointing to Jesus. Now we can boldly come before the throne of grace. Now the wall of separation between Jews and Gentiles has come down in his flesh. The things in the law that they had to do that kept them separate from God, even though he's in their presence, were pointing to what Jesus ultimately would do as an offering. His body is the food and drink offering, the grain offering, which he would cause to cease by his being cut off. That's what I was saying with Daniel 9. These Hebrew roots people like adopt this dispensational thing and because the dispensationalists think the Jews are going to have the temple come back because they're on a different covenant. And so I think the Hebrew roots will oftentimes gravitate to that theology, not realizing the implications of it. So there's this weird fusing of dispensational ideas that are totally based and developed from a rejection of our core principles as law dogs. But they get drawn to it because it seems to affirm this literal interpretation of like a temple coming back. The problem with this is that that's based on a fundamental disagreement at the core of our theology as law dogs, my fellow Hebrew roots. The 70th week was fulfilled, and that's why you can be so Jewish and part of the new covenant that's been established and not fully realized, because the church is Jewish, but not because Jesus didn't bring the covenant for the Jews and we're in the church age now where you just have a mental assent or God will burn you forever. And people like us are going to burn forever because we want to keep the Sabbath or whatever and think we're supposed to. Or that if we think Jesus saves from sin, not just from God's condemnation of us for sinning. Their whole theology is based on that. Like when it comes down to it, that theology, what it believes about the gospel and righteousness by faith, demands they might be nice to you and not say it this way. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But in reality, like when they're preaching against what they think is wrong or protecting their flock, and this is just reality. I'm not trying to disparage anybody. I'm just trying to be real. Like when it comes down to where the rubber meets the road, they don't think, the people who hold that sort of doctrine and others think we don't believe the gospel. They think we're heretics. Ultimately, they think we're not believing the real gospel, and so we're not saved. Because for their theology to be true about the separation between the church and Israel, that has to be the case. What they believe about righteousness and justification by faith, what it means to believe in Jesus. If they reject, if their theology is correct, what they preach, then we are heretics. We are not saved. Okay. We're not right before God because we're works based according to their understanding. Now, of course, they're wrong, but so sometimes people will be nice and they won't. So you have no business taking that theology, which is developed literally to make this sort of soteriology become a system. Nobody believed that theology. And the Protestants historically tended to accept the messianic interpretation of Daniel's 70th week as being fulfilled. So if that's true, then that means all those things are applying to what Christ did. And it's all over the New Testament. As far as Christ saying, I leave your temple to you desolate after they reject him. You didn't recognize the time of your visitation. It's not the Antichrist that makes a covenant with the Jews for 1 week in the future. That's the 70th week of Daniel. And that's Jesus becoming the sacrifice for sin, making reconciliation for iniquity in the 70th week. And that brings the new covenant. That's what Paul's teaching in like Hebrews. Ratifies the covenant by his blood. The New Testament, most translations say testament, but it's just a covenant. He brings the new covenant, Jeremiah 31. That's why it's quoted. He brought down this wall of separation to make one new man, bringing in the Gentiles into the Jewish church that's established by the God Jew who was under the law, who came to redeem those who were under the law and established his church all entirely while his ministry was under the law of Moses, and established that church and ratified the covenant and then sent them out to the Gentiles. The view that says the 70th week in the future, if you're curious, anybody, I can show you demonstrably that if the text says he died after the 69th week, he's cut off. Everybody agrees it's talking about Jesus being cut off, and that's salvation. But why is it salvation? See, these people depart from what's taken for granted. Oh yeah, Jesus is the Messiah. He died for our sins, blah, 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 blah. Well, that has to happen according to the scriptures. That's what 1 Corinthians 15, the mere gospel that Jesus died and was buried and rose on the third day according to the scriptures. He can't fail the text. It is written. He has to fulfill it. And everybody agrees he's cut off after the 69th week. If the next week isn't the 70th week, which is how the prophecy sets out the time period, if there's a gap and the 70th week is just randomly about the Antichrist all of a sudden when it's been talking about Jesus, then the reconciliation for iniquity, that was one of the 6 things that had to get done in the time period that's cut off, the 70 weeks which are determined, to make reconciliation for iniquity, Kippur. To make Kippur for iniquity, that's Jesus dying and ratifying the covenant. Think about Isaiah 53, all the texts that come into play on this, about what the Messiah would do. Magnify the law, make it honorable. Well, he makes reconciliation for iniquity by being the offering. And so he makes the sacrifice and oblation to cease. Why? By his sacrifice. Hebrews says this. Jesus ends the sacrificial system by being the offering on the cross. In his flesh, he abolished the ordinances, the commandments contained in ordinances. That's the diverse washing and cardinal ordinances from Hebrews 9, which it says, the context of Hebrews 9 are the things implemented by God in the earthly sanctuary as a type of the heavenly sanctuary. So you can't say it's Roman decrees or Toakano in Hebrews 9. It's saying the divinely ordained laws and ordinances in the earthly temple that God instituted are not as good as the priesthood and ministry of Christ in the heavenly greater temple and the greater covenant. And so those things, which in the King James are carnal ordinances and diverse washings, are the things they had to do to come near to the presence of God, that Jesus does once for all by his offering and taking his blood into the sanctuary in heaven to remove the people's sins and make it so that we can have communion with God through him and the Spirit, which now dwells in us, and we're like a temple now. So the presence of God is with us, and he writes his law in your heart. It's unmistakable that Paul's teaching that theology, because that's the purpose. We're being transformed to the image of the Son. Now God's done this work that makes it so the Spirit can enter us and we can start to grow towards being able to be in his direct presence by not rebelling anymore because he's holy. You just really can't get around it. Like, to say, is this like, I don't think people are total heretics for like wanting to read the Old Testament prophecies and think things are coming back and trying to say, well, they're not sin sacrifices. They're when Jesus comes back, he's going to restore the heavens and the earth. So, and we're not going to sin anymore in our new bodies. And we get the new bodies when Jesus comes back next and executes the judgment. How is there a millennium after that? All the wicked are killed until the 1,000 years are through, and then they're finally judged and destroyed in the lake of fire. But at the coming of Jesus, all the saints are resurrected into their glorified bodies and nobody sins anymore. Why would we need animal sacrifices? Why would we need to kill animals when they're living creatures that God intended to not be killed? And they're only implemented as a teaching about the problem of sin. Having to kill an animal that you love and take care of Like, that wasn't God's original plan, to eat living creatures. Have you ever seen a Komodo dragon eat like a baby pig that's alive and screaming? We're going to like slit animals' throats forever as a commemoration of the one sacrifice that Christ did once for all. We have to keep killing animals forever? Or is like death and suffering and the need to understand repentance and the life is in the blood, we're going to bring that back as a celebration? We're going to eat living creatures forever. Did God intend that originally? I thought this was a restoration. There are no animal sacrifices in the future, my friend, because we're under a better covenant. So I get it, but let it go.